Hi, I'm Peter Adams, and I'm the head of the News Literacy Project's research and design team, and I'm here today to give you an update on a crucially important addition to our Checkology Virtual Classroom platform, a lesson about the history of harm caused by racist and substandard journalism and the resulting legacies of distrust among Black Americans. The lesson makes clear the fact that it's intended as a kind of case study to help bring other histories of harmful coverage affecting more groups of people into focus. The need for this resource is both acute and persistent. In fact, we broke ground on the earliest planning stages several years ago, and we're in the midst of our initial discovery phase in the summer of 2020, when the murder of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis tragically brought the topic back to the center of the national conversation. We've produced specific resources that address select aspects of this topic before, for example, a classroom guide in partnership with Facing History and ourselves about news coverage of the killing of Michael Brown and the subsequent unrest in Ferguson in 2014. But it wasn't until relatively recently that we had an established platform, Checkology, and the capacity we needed to address this difficult subject in a more comprehensive way. The process has extended beyond what we initially anticipated. Simply put, it required more research, more conversations, and more careful review, including historical fact-checking, than any other lesson we've ever produced, by a substantial margin. We needed to find a way to accurately describe the shameful history of racism in mainstream news sources without exacerbating the sense of cynicism or nihilism about those sources that can be so disempowering that so many students already have coming into the classroom. And we also wanted to be sure to show the many ways that newsrooms and news organizations have improved over the last 20 years, but without idealizing those legacy organizations or minimizing the harm they still sometimes cause. To host this lesson, we worked with longtime NLP volunteer Natalie Moore, a veteran journalist who has spent the last 15 years covering segregation and inequality for WBEZ Chicago. The lesson is divided into 5 main chapters: an introduction, a chapter exploring what it means to trust news media, a chapter laying out a series of case histories across 3 historic periods, a chapter focused on the role of the Black press during these periods, and a chapter examining opportunities for further progress. Today, I'll be walking you through the 3rd chapter, which presents case histories from the Jim Crow era, the Civil Rights era, and the late 20th century. We'll take a look at how Natalie introduces the chapter, and then I'll skip ahead through some key moments and join you in a bit. I just wanted to take a moment to note here that this chapter and this walkthrough does contain graphic images and descriptions of difficult historic events. This is something we're very clear in the lesson about and in the teacher documentation as well.
The legacies of harm and distrust in mainstream news stretch back to the earliest roots of journalism in the United States. To truly understand these issues today, we need to take a look at this long and painful history and work through some examples of outrageously racist and harmful reporting. In this chapter, we'll look at 3 notable periods in history that specifically impacted Black Americans: the Jim Crow era, the Civil Rights era, and the late 20th century. During Jim Crow, which lasted into the 1960s, lynchings were an all too common occurrence, and the vast majority of those murdered by lynch mobs were Black men and boys. Lynchings were typically prompted by false or overblown accusations of violating segregation laws and norms. Local news coverage of these violent attacks was often blatantly racist and inhumane, and sometimes even inflamed white anger and fueled even more violence. Let's take a look at 3 such incidents and how they were covered by the news media at the time. The first happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. Both local newspapers, the Tulsa Tribune and the Tulsa World, blamed the massacre on Greenwood's Black residents.
And then, of course, throughout the lesson, we have assessments like this free response question for students.
Our second example of harmful news coverage in the Jim Crow era took place in 1949 in Lake County, Florida. 3 men and 1 minor, who was only 16, were accused of raping a white woman and attacking her husband. While 2 of the men may have encountered the couple, the other 2 were not even in the area at the time. The accusations were baseless. How did this story play out in the local press? If it were living up to the standards and ideals of journalism, the local press should have acted as a watchdog, investigating the discrepancies in the story and questioning the police's version of events. They would have exposed the fact that 2 of the accused men didn't even know the other 2. They would have discovered that the couple who claimed to have been attacked had a troubled past. And they would have put a spotlight on the circumstances that led to the brutal murder of the man who fled. Instead, the initial local news reports in Groveland simply took the police at their word, publishing their account of the incident as fact. The major regional newspaper in the area, the Orlando Morning Sentinel, published inflammatory headlines and reports.
And here again is an example of an assessment, this time a multiple choice question that is included in the Groveland case history.
Thousands of black men were lynched during the Jim Crow era, and the mainstream press generally did little to shine a spotlight on this heinous practice. In many cases, newspapers even helped fan the flames of violence against the black community, as in Tulsa and Groveland. Perhaps the most infamous lynching in modern American history is the murder of a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till. Reports in the Mississippi press included photos of the men who murdered Till beaming in their military uniforms and portrayed the woman who accused Till as a virtuous beauty queen and mother. The murder of Emmett Till came toward the end of the Jim Crow era and made headlines all over the country. But it was the publication of the gruesome photographs of Till's mutilated body in Jet magazine and later in the Chicago Defender that galvanized outrage among black Americans.
Next, we take a look at coverage during the Civil Rights era.
Throughout the Civil Rights Movement, black leaders spoke out against discrimination and organized boycotts and protests to end segregation and secure equal rights. When the Reverend George W. Lee, a black pastor and voting rights advocate, was shot and killed in his car while driving home, a local segregationist sheriff claimed he died in a traffic accident. As black leaders called for a federal investigation into the assassination, the local newspaper, the Clarion Ledger, published a headline that read, "Negro Leader Dies in Odd Accident," affirming the sheriff's absurd version of events. The Clarion Ledger's racial bias showed itself again the day after the March on Washington in 1963, a gathering of some 250,000 people led by Reverend Martin Luther King, when it ran a front-page headline that, on its surface, focused on the trash left behind by the protesters, but it also offered readers a deeply racist double meaning.
At this point in the lesson, we spend a bit of time exploring the Kerner Commission report, which was published in 1968 and lays out some recommendations on, among other things, how news media in the U.S. Can cover black Americans in a way that's more equitable and fair and representative. These recommendations become relevant later in the 5th chapter when we look at opportunities for progress, because sadly, many of these issues remain today.
The decades following the Kerner Commission report were marked by slow progress. In 1989, over 20 years after the Kerner Commission released their recommendations, a horrifying story played out on the front pages of New York City's newspapers. A woman was raped, brutally beaten, and left for dead while jogging in Central Park. Reports about the teens immediately dubbed them the Central Park Five, or at other times as the Wolf Pack. Though it occurred 40 years after the Groveland 4 case during the Jim Crow era, the coverage in the tabloid press was appallingly similar. Many news reports dehumanized the teens, quoting sources who described them as animals, savages, human mutations, and bloodthirsty. These outrageously biased descriptions intensified public outrage, pandered to racial fears, and created an us versus them atmosphere that resembled the Jim Crow era. The immediate coverage of the Central Park Five also showed an over-reliance on police narratives with no attempt to dig deeper or question authorities' claims.
And here again, students answer an assessment question before we pivot toward more contemporary questions and issues here at the end of the chapter.
In many newsrooms, reporters and editors are hesitant to describe overtly discriminatory actions as racist, out of concern that doing so might appear to be biased. Instead, this coverage might quote a person who calls an action racist and then quote someone else who has a different perspective, or use euphemisms like racially charged or racially motivated that stop short of calling racism out by name. It is generally important to provide balance in news reports, but not when you're dealing with matters of fact. To be sure, there is no question that news coverage today is fairer, more accurate, and much more inclusive than it was throughout the last century. Nonetheless, many of the patterns of harm, privileging police narratives, biased sourcing, and distorted representations can still be seen in some news coverage today.
We'll be launching the full version of the lesson in mid-January to coincide with National News Literacy Week, and we have a number of promotional events planned to be sure educators all across the country know about this important new resource. It is, we feel, a unique and long overdue contribution to the field of news literacy, and is a project that would not have been possible without your generous support and forbearance as we worked through what turned out to be a significantly challenging but deeply worthwhile process. Thank you again.